Hi, I'm Alex. If you're new here, welcome. If not, welcome back. As you can see, my bookshelves look a little bare right now, and that is because we are talking about every book that I read in 2023 today. So I did a lot of reading from like Libby and Kindle Unlimited, so the number of books that I physically have, while still fairly large, is not going to make up all of this. So yeah, I'm going to talk about basically the book title, what I rated it, and if I would recommend it or not. Let's get into it. So the first book that I read this year is Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. I rated it 4 stars. I don't really remember anything about it now, but I know that I would recommend it. It was cute. The second book I read this year was Inferno by Dante, which is part of the Divine trilogy. I rated it 2 stars. It took me forever to get through. It's a classic, so I would recommend it, but it's hard to understand in my opinion. The next book I read is somewhere in this pile. Was Good Girl, Bad Blood by Holly Jackson. I rated this 4 stars, and I would definitely recommend the Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy. Not really the novella, but we'll get there. The next book I read was The Fiction Between Us by Julia Olivia. I read this on Kindle Unlimited. I rated it 4 stars. I absolutely loved it and want to read more of the series. I would highly recommend it, especially if you're a Disney fan or you like the Dreamland Billionaire series. Next book I read was I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I do not rate memoirs, but I absolutely loved it. If I rated them, it would have been 5 stars, and I would highly recommend, especially the audiobook version. The next book I read was Amusing Ourselves to Death, which, again, I don't rate nonfiction. I didn't love it, but there's some interesting things in there if the content is something that you're interested in. The next book I read was a classic, Atomic Habits. Again, I don't rate nonfiction, but I would recommend it if you need a little help kickstarting some habits. Next book I read was All Your Perfects by Colleen Hoover. When I read this book, I absolutely loved it. I want to do a reread of it now. It's one of my favorite Coho books, and I rated it 5 stars. The next book I read was The Good Lie by A.R. Torr. I rated it 3.5 stars, and I don't remember anything about it, so I can't tell you if I would recommend it or not. The next book I read was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I rated it 3.5 stars. I know people love this to their core, so I would recommend it because you might be one of those people. Next book I read was Counterfeit by Kristen Chen. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was entertaining. I rated it 3 stars, and I would recommend it. The next book I read was The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Again, I don't rate nonfiction. I don't think I would recommend this one. The next book I read was As Good as Dead by Holly Jackson. This is the 3rd book in the Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy. I rated it 4.5 stars, and again, I would highly recommend. The next book I read was The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. I also rated this 4.5 stars, and I would highly recommend. The next book I read was ACOTAR. I rated this 4.5 stars, and everybody needs to read this book. I don't care what books you like, you need to read this one. The next book I read was The Do-Over by Lynn Painter. I rated it 4 stars, and I would recommend it if you're looking for like a YA palette cleanser. The next book I read was The Lazy Genius Way, and honestly, again, I don't rate nonfiction, but I would highly recommend this one. I thought it was very interesting and had some good tips in it. The next book I read was The Chemistry of Love by Soraya Wilson. I rated it 3 stars. I remember being entertained and thinking it was cute, but not anything out of this world, so again, if you're looking for a palette cleanser, this one was pretty good. The next book I read was The Quarry Girls by Jess Lowry. I rated it 3 stars. There's definitely some trigger warnings for this one, so check them, but it's an interesting story, so I would recommend it. The next book that I read was The Final Offer by Lauren Asher. This is the 3rd book in the Dreamland Billionaire series. I rated it 5 stars. I would highly recommend this series overall, especially if you're a Disney fan. Next book I read was Carrie Soto Is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I rated it 4.5 stars. Could not believe how much I loved it, and even if you don't seem like you'd be interested in it, pick it up because it's really good. Next book I read was was Excuse Me While I Disappear by Lori Naturo. I don't rate nonfiction. I thought it was a fun listen. I'm not sure that I would recommend it though, especially for like this age, because it's definitely set to target an older audience. The next book I read was A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. I rated it 5 stars, and again, I would highly recommend this whole series. The next book I read was A Court of Wings and Ruin by Sarah J. Maas. I rated it 5 stars, and yes, I would highly recommend the whole series. The next book I read was A Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J. Maas. I rated it 3.5 stars, not as good as the rest of the series, but I would still recommend reading it. The next book I read was A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. I rated it 4.5 stars, and I would highly recommend it. Next book I read was The Keeper of Enchanted Rooms by Charlie Holmberg. It's a very cozy fantasy book. I rated it 3 stars. I don't know why my camera keeps stopping. The next book I read was Anatomy of Meat Cute by Addie Goldridge. I really liked this book. I rated it 4 stars, and I would highly recommend it. The next book I read was The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. This is my least favorite of Lucy Foley's books. I rated it 3 stars, and I guess I would recommend it, but her other books are definitely better than this one. Next book I read was The Sun and Her Flowers by Ruby Carr. It's very good poetry. Not my favorite of Ruby Carr's, but still really good, and I don't rate this kind of book. Next book I read was If You Tell by Greg Olson. I didn't rate it because it's nonfiction, but again, there's some darker topics, so check trigger warnings before you pick it up. Next book I read was The No-Show by Beth O'Leary, which I do own, but I think I actually have it in like an unhaul pile because I really didn't like it. I rated it 3 stars, and it's right here. And I talked about this in my 2023 book tag video about why this was really frustrating for me. The next book I read was The Housemaid's Secret by Frida McFadden. I rated it 4 stars. I didn't think it was as good as The Housemaid, but I still enjoyed it, and I would recommend it. Next book I read was Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. I thought it was interesting. It's nonfiction, so no rating, but I guess I would recommend it. The next book I read was The Song of Achilles, which I have a fairly unpopular opinion about this book. I did rate it 4 stars, but I didn't love it. You might like it better than I did, but yeah, I would recommend it, but it wasn't my favorite. The next book I read this year was Happy Place by Emily Henry. I rated it 5 stars, and I would highly recommend it. The next book I read this year was Confess by Colleen Hoover. I rated this 3.5 stars. This is one of my least favorite Coho books. I thought it was alright, but nothing special. I guess I would recommend it, but I don't know. The next book I read this year was Heartstopper, Volume 1. I rated it 4 stars. I really loved it. I would highly recommend it. The next book was Better Than the Movies by Lynn Painter. I rated this 4 stars. Again, if you're looking for a YA palette cleanser, this one is really good. Next book I read was Vacation Wars by Megan Quinn. I feel like I don't hear this book talked about nearly as enough. I rated it 4.5 stars. I really loved it and would highly recommend it. The next books on here, I could not, in good faith, recommend to a single human being on the planet. But they are Haunting and Hunting Adeline. I rated them both 4.5 stars. I loved these, but again, I would not recommend them for literally anyone. So go down that path if you choose to, but not by my recommendation. The next book I read was Bossy Pants by Tina Fey. Again, a memoir that I really enjoyed, but I don't rate nonfiction. I would recommend it though, especially if you're interested in SNL or have watched the show 30 Rock. It goes into those pretty well. The next book I read was One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus. I rated this 4 stars. I thought it was good. It took me a little while to get into, but I would recommend it. The next book I read, I should have organized my books, was The Rosie Project by Graham Simpson. The beginning of this book was really slow for me. I rated it 3.5 stars, but by the end I really liked it, and I do want to read the second one, so I would recommend it. The next book I read was The Bride Test by Helen Huang. I rated this 4 stars, sort of the same plot vibe as The Rosie Project, but I thought it was done a little bit better, and I would recommend it. Then I read Heartstopper Volume 2. I also rated that 4 stars, and I would recommend it. And then I read Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. I rated this 5 stars. It was the first Abby Jimenez book I ever read, and I would highly, highly, highly recommend this one. Next book I read was Killjoy. I rated it 3 stars. It did leave a major plot hole for me that I didn't love, but if you like the A Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy, I would recommend it. The next book I read, and I didn't pull this one because I didn't think I read it this year, was The Goal by Elle Kennedy. I rated this 4.5 stars. I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I was going to, and I would recommend this whole series. The next book I read was Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. I think I had this book overhyped for me, but I rated it 4.5 stars. I did enjoy it, but not to the extent that I thought I would, but I would recommend it overall. Next book I read was Then She Was Gone by Lisa Jewell. I rated this 3.5 stars. I thought there were a couple of plot holes that were a little frustrating, but overall I would recommend it. The next book I read was Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. I rated this 5 stars. I absolutely loved it, would highly recommend it, but not if you don't like spice. The next book that I read was Flamer by Mike Curato. This was causing big controversy in Connecticut for some of the content and getting banned in school, so I wanted to see what it was about. I rated it 3 stars. I didn't love it, and I definitely understand why it was causing controversy. I don't know that I would recommend it. Next book I read was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I know there's a boycott going on. I'm not going to mention that I didn't read the book, so I rated it 4.5 stars. I did enjoy it. Maybe wait till the boycott's over if you want to pick it up. The next book I read was Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. I rated this 4 stars. I definitely didn't enjoy it as much as ACOTAR. I would say I'm on Kingdom of Ash now, and I'm definitely at that point now, but at this point I wasn't there yet. Next book I read was Heartstopper Volume 3, also by Alice Oseman. Also rated it 4 stars, would highly recommend. Next book I read was The Inmate by Frida McFadden. I rated it 3.5 stars, and I would highly recommend. The next book I read was Below Zero by Allie Hazelwood, which is in Loathe to Love You, one of the novellas in here, and really enjoyed it. I rated it 3 stars. That's what I rate most novellas. Next book I read was Ward D by Frida McFadden. I think this is in my top 4 Frida books. I rated it 4 stars, and I would recommend. The next book in here is Never Lie by Frida McFadden. Again, in my top 4 Frida books. I really liked this one. Similar vibes, not vibes, but I had a similar feeling reading it that I did to The Housemaid, and I would recommend it. The next book in here is Do Not Disturb by Frida McFadden. This is my least favorite one of her books. I rated it 3 stars. I don't know that I would recommend it, but if you need a fast thriller that you're going to get through really quick, maybe. The next book I read this year was The Happy Ever After playlist by Abby Jimenez. I rated it 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed it. Just a cute, fluffy rom-com, and I would recommend it. Next book I read was Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson. I feel like this book was all over the place, so I needed to read it. I rated it 3.5 stars, and if you're a lit fic person, I would recommend it, but it's mostly rich people drama. The next book I read was Heartstopper Volume 4. I once again rated it 4 stars, and I would recommend the whole series. The next book I read was One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I rated it 3.5 stars. This is my least favorite Taylor Jenkins Reid book that I've read so far. I would still recommend it, but it was not my favorite of hers. Next book I read was Mr. Wrong Number by Lynn Painter, and I loved it. I rated it 4 stars and would highly recommend. Next book I read was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. At the time I rated it 4 stars, but now looking back on this, it's probably a 5-star read for me. Loved it, would highly recommend, especially if you're into dark academia. The next book I read was Under One Roof, which again is from Loathe to Love You, and enjoyed it. I rated it 3 stars. Would recommend it. The next book I read was Call Me By Your Name, which is one of those books that ended up in my donate pile. I rated it 3 stars. Definitely was expecting more from it. It was okay. I would make, if you really liked like the Song of Achilles, I would recommend it, but it felt like the same plot, not done as well. Next book I read was Every Summer After by Carly Fortune. This is my most disappointing read of 2023. I rated it 2.5 stars, and I would not recommend it. Instead, I would recommend you go read the books that they copy and pasted off of for this one. The next book I read was The Summer I Turned Pretty by Jenny Han. I rated this 4 stars. It was a reread for me. I have read the series like probably 20 times in my life, so I really enjoy it and would highly recommend. Next book I read was Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. At the time I rated it 4.5 stars. Again, looking back, I probably would rate it 5 now. I would highly recommend. Next 2 books are It's Not Summer Without You and We'll Always Have Summer by Jenny Han. I rated them both 4 stars. Again, rereads for me. Really enjoyed them as always and would recommend them. The next book I read was A Flicker in the Dark by Stacey Willingham. I don't even know that I remember what this book. Oh, okay. I do remember what this book was about. I rated it 3.5 stars, and I would recommend it if you're looking for a thriller, but I did guess the plot twist. The next book I read was Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood. I rated this 5 stars. It's my favorite Ali Hazelwood book, and I would highly recommend it. The next book I read was The Bodyguard by Catherine Senner. I rated this 4 stars, and I would highly recommend it, especially if you're looking for a closed-door romance. Next book I read was Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. I rated it 3.5 stars. I think definitely my least favorite in the Throne of Glass series. The next book I read was Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. I rated this 5 stars. This is the first book. You're supposed to read it before yours truly. I read it after. It's fine. It didn't really matter. Again, rated at 5 stars. Would highly recommend it. The next book I read was The Naturals by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. I rated this 3.5 stars. I did really enjoy it and would highly recommend it. Next book I read was the last book in the last novella in Loathe to Love You that I had left, which is Stuck With You. I rated it 3 stars and would highly recommend it. Next book I read was What Happened to the Bennetts by Lisa Scottoline. I rated it 3 stars. I don't think I would recommend this one. It's a little wild. If you're looking for like an out-of-pocket thriller, maybe. The next book I read was... I can't find it. The next book I read was The Legacy by Al Kennedy. This is the last book in the Off-Campus series. I rated it 4 stars. It was nice seeing all the characters together again, but not my favorite in the series. Next book I read was Fourth Wing. This is my special edition one, but I do have the other one on my shelf too. I rated it 5 stars. I loved this book. The next book I read was Romantic Comedy by Curtis Steinfeld. I rated it 3 stars. I thought it was okay. I honestly preferred Tina Fey's memoir to this, so I don't know that I would recommend it. The next book I read was The Summer of Broken Rules by Kale Walther. I rated it 4.5 stars and highly recommend it. My camera is flashing. We'll see how much I can get through before my camera dies. Next book I read was Nora Goes Off Script by Annabelle Monaghan. I rated this 3.5 stars. I thought it was okay. The next book I read was Misdemeanor. I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought it would. I rated it 3.5 stars and I would highly recommend it. Next book I read was None Shall Sleep by Ellie Marney. I preferred this to the Natural series. I rated it 4 stars and would highly recommend it. The next book I read was One of Us Is Next by Karen M. McManus. I rated this 3.5 stars. I did not enjoy it as much as the first one, but I guess I would still recommend it. Next book I read was The Chain by Adrienne McKenty. I did not enjoy this nearly as much as I thought I would. I rated it 3 stars, and I suppose I would recommend it, but it's a little dark, honestly. The next book I read was If He Had Been With Me by Laura Nowlin. I loved this book. I rated it 4 stars, and I would highly recommend it, but it is sad. So just know that going in. The next book I read was A Bunny by Mona Awad. This book was a roller coaster. I rated it 3 stars. I don't know that I would recommend it. Like, maybe. I don't know. Then I did a reread of Book Lovers. The first time I read this, I rated it 4.5 stars. This time I rated it 5 by Emily Henry and would highly recommend it. The next book I read was Throttled by Lauren Asher. I rated this 3.5 stars. I didn't like it as much as the Dreamland Billionaire series, but I still really enjoyed it. Next book I read was The Sinful Lives of Trophy Wives by Kristen Miller. I rated it 2 stars. Did not enjoy it. Would not recommend it. Next book I read was When in Rome by Sarah Adams. I rated it 3.5 stars. It was okay. I would recommend it if you're looking for a fluffy romance. Next book I read was Before the Coffee Gets Cold. I'm not even going to try on the author's name. I rated it 2.5 stars. I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would, but it's a really interesting concept. The next book I read was Tweet Cute by Emma Lord. I rated this 3.5 stars. Again, a cute, fluffy YA romance if you're looking for that. Next book I read was Sometimes I Lie by Alice Feeney. I rated this 3 stars. Did not enjoy it nearly as much as I thought I would, but I would still recommend it if you're looking for a thriller. Next book I read was The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary. I rated it 3 stars, and I suppose I would recommend it, but it's not my favorite. Next book I read was Spanish Love Deception by Elena Armas. I rated it 5 stars, and I would highly recommend it. Next book I read was Paris, the Memoirs, Paris Hilton's memoir. Again, I don't rate nonfiction, but I really enjoyed it and would recommend it. Next book I read was Some Shall Break by Ellie Marney. This is the second book to None Shall Sleep. I rated it 4 stars, really enjoyed it and would recommend it. Next book I read was The Locked Door by Frida McFadden. This kind of is even with me, for me, with Do Not Disturb. I rated it 3 stars. It was okay. I don't know that I would, super highly recommend it, though. Next book I read was Collided by Lauren Asher. I rated this 3.5 stars, and I would recommend it. It's the second book in the Dirty Air series. Next book I read was The Love Wager by Lynn Painter. I rated this 4.5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. Next book I read was The Nanny by Lana Ferguson. I rated this 4 stars. Really enjoyed it. Would highly recommend both of these. The Nanny, only if you're looking for spice. Next book I read was The Wife Upstairs by Frida McFadden. I rated it 2.5 stars. I did not really enjoy this one at all and would not recommend it. Next book I read was Secretly Yours by Tessa Bailey. I rated it 3 stars. I thought it was okay. Maybe I would recommend it, but not sure. The next book I read was Happily Ever After by Kira Cass. It's like the novellas that go with the selection series. I rated it 3 stars. It was nice being back in that universe. Next book I read was Homebody by Ruby Carr. This is my favorite of her collections of poetry. I don't rate those, but I would highly recommend picking it up. Next book I read was Same Time Next Summer by Annabelle Monaghan, which I thought I owned, but I guess I don't. I rated it 3.5 stars, really enjoyed it, and would recommend it. Next book I read was Call It What You Want by Alyssa DeRogatis. I rated it 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it and would recommend it. Next book I read was Wrecked by Lauren Asher. I rated it 4 stars. It's the 3rd book in the Dirty Air series, and I would recommend it. Next book I read was Finley Donovan, Knocks 'Em Dead. I didn't enjoy this as much as the first one. I rated it 3 stars, but I would still recommend it. Next book I read was Redeemed by Lauren Asher. This is the last book in the Dirty Air series. I rated it 3.5 stars, and I really enjoyed it and would recommend it. Next book I read was The American Roommate Experiment by Elena Armas. This is technically the second book in the Spanish Love Deception. I really enjoyed this. I rated it 4.5 stars. Next book I read was Killer Instinct by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. I rated this 4 stars. I liked it more than The Naturals, and would highly recommend that whole series. Next book I read was The Fall of Bradley Reed by Morgan Elizabeth. I rated it 3.5 stars. It was okay. I would recommend it if you're looking for something fast. Then I read the Mindfuck series, which is made out of 5 books. It's a 5-star series for me, and I would highly recommend it and have to literally everyone since I read it. The next book I read was The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager. I was expecting to like this a lot more. I did rate it 4 stars. I thought the plot twist was just a little out of nowhere, and didn't really make sense. Next book I read was Fair Play by Eve Rodsky. This is nonfiction, so I didn't rate it. If you're having problems in your home life with roommates, I would say this is a really good book to help mitigate those things. Next book I read was 7 Year Slip by Ashley Poston. I rated this 4.5 stars. Really enjoyed it. Would highly recommend it. The next book I read was Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. I rated this 4 stars. Really enjoyed it. Would highly recommend it. Next book I read was Butcher and Blackbird by Bryn Weaver. I've recommended this to every person I talked to since I read it. Would highly recommend it. The next book I read was Air of Fire by Sarah J. Maas. I rated this 4.5 stars. This is when I started to really get into the Throne of Glass series and would highly recommend the whole thing. The next book I read was A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. I rated it 3.5 stars at the time, but have been thinking about it more since, so I definitely would recommend this book. I enjoyed it a lot and can't wait to get into book 2. Next book I read was The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. I rated this 4 stars. I still think about it at least once a week and would highly recommend it. The next book I read, I found the legacy finally, was The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I bought this because of the special edition. I rated this 3.5 stars. It's, again, a cozy fantasy if that's what you're looking for. And then I read Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. I rated it 4.5 stars. I enjoyed it. Again, maybe wait till the boycott's over if you want to read it. The next book I read was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I rated this 2.5 stars. I did not enjoy it. I probably would not recommend it, but it is considered like a classic work of literature, so if that's important to you, then read it. Next book I read was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I loved this book and was not expecting to. I rated it 4.5 stars and would highly recommend it. Next book I read was Queen of Shadows by Sarah J. Maas. I rated it 4.5 stars and again would highly recommend the whole series. Then I read Christmas in Coconut Creek by Carissa Kinward. This is one of my favorite Christmas reads this year. Wait, hold on. That's a lie. I rated it 3 stars. It was okay. I guess I would recommend it. Then I read Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros. I rated this 5 stars. Would highly recommend. I know a lot of people have some issues with this. I did not. I loved it. The next book I read was Same Time Next Year by Tessa Bailey. I rated it 3 stars. It was pretty cute, but really short. Next book I read was The Gingerbread House in Mistletoe Gardens. It was kind of a random, like, Spotify listen. I rated it 3 stars. I enjoyed it. Maybe next holiday season pick it up. Very heartwarming, very homework. The next book I read was The Honeymoon Crashers. It's a sequel to The Young Honeymooners by Christina Lauren. I rated it 4 stars. I enjoyed it, but I'm also a huge fan of The Young Honeymooners, so keep that in mind. Next book I read is Practice Makes Perfect by Sarah Adams. I rated this 3.5 stars. I enjoyed this more than When in Rome and would recommend it. Next book I read was The Graham Effect by Elle Kennedy. I loved this book. I rated it 4 stars. I can't wait for the second one to come out and would highly recommend it, especially if you're a fan of the Off-Campus series. I am back and my camera is fully charged now, but I just went to open my Storygraph and it's down for maintenance, so that's fun. Luckily, I wrote down all of the books in my planner, but I don't have the ratings in here, so we might have to guess on a few things. So I was on the X-Hex when my camera died. I'm pretty sure I rated this 3.5 stars by Erin Sterling. I'd recommend it. Don't read it in December like I did. Read it for Halloween. It'll make a lot more like sense. And I might have rated it higher if I had done that. The next book that I read was Big Nick Energy by Morgan Elizabeth. This is one of my favorite of her books. I rated it, I think, 4 stars, but it honestly might have even been 4.5. Definitely my favorite Christmas book of the year. And yeah, I really enjoyed it and would highly recommend it. But again, read it around Christmas, although it is cute any time of the year. The next book that I read was A Hunt So Wicked, and I don't know who the author of this is. By Britt Andrews. It's the first book. I think it's going to be a trilogy, but there's only one out right now. And I scoured the internet trying to find out when the second book was coming out as soon as I finished it because it was so good. It's like the Selection meets Hunger Games and a dark romance, but not in terms of spicy. I don't know. It's definitely a fantasy read, but a little bit darker. I really, really enjoyed it. I believe I rated it 4.5 stars, but it was really close to being 5. Very good. Would highly recommend that one, especially if you like the Selection series. The next book I read was The Holiday Swap by Maggie Knox. This was another just like Christmas audiobook that I listened to. I enjoyed it. It was cute. It was entertaining. I either rated this 3 or 3.5 stars. Like I said, I enjoyed it. Would recommend it for Christmas time. Not necessarily any other time of the year though. And then I did a reread of The Inheritance Games. I read this last September in the middle of a 24-hour reading challenge, and my brain was like absolutely fried, and I could not really remember anything from it, and I wanted to continue on with the series. So I did a reread. I rated it 4 stars. Really enjoyed it and would highly recommend if you haven't read it yet. Next book I read was A Mile High by Liz Tomforte. I liked it. I thought it was pretty good. I think I rated it 3.5 stars. And I would recommend it. It is spicy and it is sports romance, so just know that going in. And then I ended the year by doing the tandem read of Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn, continuing on with the Throne of Glass series, and rated Empire of Storms 5 stars and Tower of Dawn 4.5. I really enjoyed them. Empire of Storms is definitely my favorite in the series thus far, but I really liked Tower of Dawn too. So that is everything that I read in 2023. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.